Today, we're going to be combining a number of observations we've made so far in this series. Previously, we talked about menorah patterns, 3 plus 1 plus 3 structuring, and how special emphasis was often placed on the fourth and seventh, or the middle and last items of a list. One example we looked at, Exodus chapters 25 through 31, the Lord spoke to Moses, is used 7 times. The middle speech concerned the anointing oil mixture in Exodus 30:22 through 33. This middle speech itself contained a list of 7 objects to be anointed. The center of those 7 items was the menorah. This all mirrors the 7 days of creation, where in the 4th day, the middle day of 7, the heavenly lights are installed. The term there for lights, in Genesis 1:14 and following, is nearly always only used for the lights of the menorah. Keep these menorah patterns in mind, and we'll return back to this concept. In these investigations, we've mostly looked at microstructures, individual lists, individual psalms, and the like. This time, I want to also look at macrostructures, in this case, collections of entire psalms. Then we'll zoom into the micro level. The Psalter is divided into 5 books. Many think this is an echo of the 5 books of Moses. As James Hamilton notes in his Psalms commentary, books 2 and 3 of the Psalter form a chiasm. So we see in Psalms 42 through 49 are composed by the sons of Korah, and that's mirrored by Psalms 84 through 89. The single psalm of Asaph in Psalm 50 is mirrored by the 11 psalms of Asaph in 73 through 83, and that puts at the center David. But today, we want to focus on the Psalms of Asaph in Book 3. As a side note, by the way, Book 3 contains 17 psalms. So does Book 4. 17 is one of the values of the divine name Yahweh, and the Hebrew term for glory, kavod. But back to the Psalms of Asaph in Book 3, again, Hamilton notes that collectively they're chiastic. The center psalm, Psalm 78, is noteworthy on many different levels. And I look forward to one day studying it in depth. It's the second longest psalm by word count. And different traditions place the center of the entire Psalter, the entire book of the Psalms, somewhere following verse 35 to verse 38 of Psalm 78. And we'll loop back to that discussion later. Now remember, Psalm 78 itself was the center of the 11 Asaphite Psalms in Book 3. With that in mind, Caspar Labuschagne wrote of this psalm, in terms of the 528 words of the psalm, the arithmetic center is constituted by the 10 words in verses 34 through 35a, and that breaks down to 259 plus 10 plus 259. Though these words are in themselves meaningful, they do not constitute the consciously designed meaningful center. A better candidate is to be found on verse line level, since the verse line appears to be the primary compositional building block of the psalm. Psalm 78 has distinct meaningful centers on verse line level in each of its 3 cantos. Therefore, there is every reason to look for the meaningful center of the entire psalm on the level of its 77 verse lines. The middle verse line is the 7-word verse 35. And that verse reads, "They remembered that God was their rock, and that God Most High redeemed them." Labuschagne continues, verse 35a happens to be the pivotal colon. Additionally, the middle occurrence of the 3 instances of Most High, that is elyon, falls precisely within verse 35. Now, before we get to the next observation, I want to recap what we've looked at so far. Book 3 is the center book of the Psalter. Within Book 3 is Psalm 78, which itself contains the center cluster of the Psalms of Asaph, as well as the center of the entire Psalter. Within Psalm 78, there are 3 cantos. Inside this middle canto are verses 34 through 35, which is the center on a word level and verse level, and verse 35, according to Labuschagne, is the center colon as well, which breaks down to 81 plus 1 plus 81. So we started viewing the Psalter as a whole, and then zoom down to the verse line level. So moving on, of these 11 Asaphite psalms, the title Elyon, Most High, shows up 7 times. The references are 73:11, 77:10, 78:17, 78:35, 78:56, 82:6, and 83:18. As you probably noticed, the middle 3 uses occur in Psalm 78. The center of the 3 and the center of the 7 occurs precisely in verse 35. If that's not strange enough for you, this center canto is pretty long. It matches the length of other psalms. In fact, the middle canto's 58 words is exactly the same length as another psalm of Asaph, Psalm 82. I noted in that video on Psalm 82 that it's 58 words. They're divided 2 different ways into 26 and 32. Probably was a reference to the title Most High, which occurs in verse 6, because 58 happens to be the number value of elyon, Most High. The math breakdown is 16 plus 12 plus 10 plus 6 plus 14. Restated another way, in the 11 Asaphite Psalms of Book 3, the center usage of the title elyon, which numerically equals 58, occurs within a center canto, itself made up of 58 words. So that was the middle branch of our menorah. But what about the 7th? The 7th and last use of the title elyon occurs in the last line of the last psalm of Asaph, where we have an explicit identification of who exactly elyon is. And here, I'm, and maybe Asaph was, taking a shot at the source-critical people that try to claim elyon in Psalm 82:6 is not Yahweh but some other deity. But the last verse that Asaph composed, he wrote, "That they may know that you alone, whose name is Yahweh, are elyon over all the earth." Now, there's one more aspect to this we need to take a look at, because I think Matthew was aware of this stuff. Now, this is from the Theopolis website. The title of this article is "The Secrets of the Middle of Matthew" by John Higgins. I'm not familiar with him or his work, but I'll put a link to this article in the description. And we're not going to read it, but I'm mostly just going to summarize what's important for us here. Many people have noted in the past that Matthew contains 5 teaching blocks of Jesus. And so this is really how the book is structured. And they're marked pretty clearly by this concluding phrase, "when Jesus finished saying these things." And here he lists the occurrences of this phrase. And of course, these 5 teaching blocks probably do mirror a Moses typology of the 5 books of Moses. And so we have the Sermon on the Mount, mirrored by the Olivet Discourse, Mission of the Kingdom, mirrored by the Greatest in the Kingdom, and then that puts at the center Matthew 13, Secrets of the Kingdom. Now, notice that these thematic connections, this thematic chiasm, also has this scenic chiasm here. Remember, we began in the Sermon on the Mount, so we go from mountain, land, sea, land, mountain. And that rather nicely fits the journey of Jesus Christ, his pre-existence on high, his coming down to earth, his dying and descending into the underworld, the sea in this case, his resurrection, and then his exaltation back into heaven. So these scenic geographical movements very nicely follow Jesus' life and ministry. But remember, Matthew 13 was the center of the chiasm of the entire Gospel of Matthew. Well, Matthew 13 itself is chiastic. So here we have a chiasm within a chiasm. We have the introduction, conclusion. B, we have the parable, the first parable to the crowds. B prime, the last parable to the disciples. C, an explanatory interlude. C prime, an explanatory interlude. D, 3 parables to the crowd. D prime, 3 parables to the disciples. And that puts at the center an explanatory interlude, fulfillment and explanation in verses 34 through 43. So a chiasm within a chiasm, the center within the center, is Matthew 13:34 through 43. Now this is very noteworthy because this center within a center begins this way. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. Now, what is he citing here? he's citing Psalm 78, specifically verse 2. But if we were to look at this, especially in the Greek, we note here that the term parable, it's the same term. So he's clearly, obviously, alluding here to Psalm, in this case, in the LXX, it's Psalm 77. He's alluding to this. So in the center of Matthew's gospel, he's quoting the center of the entire Psalter, Psalm 78. Now, a lot of this so far has been very academic or nuts and bolts kind of thing. So let's just for a brief moment think theologically about this. Psalm 78, the center of the Psalter. In the center of this, we see God, in spite of unfaithfulness, showing compassion by atoning for their iniquity. In the end of this psalm, we see David, God's servant, building the sanctuary and shepherding the people. So in a psalm that's almost uniquely dark and full of failures, we see these messianic ideas at the very end, foreshadowing the work of Christ. Now, I said I wanted to loop back to this point because there is some question about what exactly is the center. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be able to read all this, but this is the codex Leningrad. This is the oldest complete Hebrew manuscript. And we see all this stuff in the margins, the Masoretes, the menorah. They were noting all of these details in all the margins. But here, as we can see, here is elyon, Most High. So this was that center occurrence that we were talking about earlier. But here in this margin, and it seems to be missing a resh for some reason, but what this would read is something like the center of the book. That's what it says, the middle of the book. And so this note is saying that this is the center of the Psalter. Now, what's of interest, though, is the fact that this continues into 36, verse 36. So this is Psalm 78, 36. Now, in another tradition from the Babylonian Talmud, they say that the center of the Psalter is 78, 38. But even here in the Codex Leningrad, we see kind of a similar thing going on here, where this is referring to compassion, the terminology, and then we see this blank, and then it continues, KPR, which would be like Kippur, like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So this is atonement language, and then this is iniquity. So that's what it's talking about in this particular section here. So perhaps the center is verse 38, but even if it is 38, that is still very messianically significant, because that would put at the center of the Psalter, yet he being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity. So in a sense, that's like the central message of the entire Psalter. Very interesting. And I don't think that this stuff is coincidental. And it should be noted, I'm not being exhaustive by any means. I'm leaving a lot of things out to try to not be overwhelming. But I was just blown away by this. When I was looking at the Psalms of Asaph, I started coming across some of these connections. And I thought it was worth pointing out because it's not something I've done yet, is zoom out from the details to take a broader look at the way that the Psalms are connected on this larger macro level. We've talked about the connections between Psalms so far in the Psalm series, but hadn't quite done it this way, pointed out how the Psalms themselves form chiasms with each other. That's something that's very interesting because it shows great intentionality with the final form of the text. But that's about all for this time, and I'll see you guys later.